Hello, this is the beginning of 6.04 International Organizations 2, starting with slide 1. Unlike a national economy that has a government to guide and protect it, there is no single government to regulate and protect growth in the global economy. The global economy has many competitors, including international corporations as well as entire countries. Some of these competitors are seasoned veterans, while others are rookies. They share no common goal, and they have clashing agendas. And in the global marketplace, there is no single authority with the power to establish and enforce order. Still, the global economy is not a place of complete chaos. There are several important international organizations that help stabilize the global economy by coordinating the workings of international trade and finance. Sometimes the only way to get a company or a country to end objectionable practices is to use the power of money. If a country or company feels a financial effect, it may change its unacceptable behavior. This gives governments and international organizations a set of tools to influence the global economy: economic sanctions. Sanctions can be used to try to pressure economic players into changing certain behaviors. Economic sanctions vary, but they are all intended to punish behaviors that are perceived as threatening or harmful to the global economy, a national economy, groups of people, or natural resources. Sometimes economic sanctions are also used to punish political behavior that is seen as unacceptable. Boycotts. One of the most commonly used types of sanction is a boycott. Boycotts are organized efforts used to protest and punish practices that are considered unfair. Boycotts are often undertaken by citizen groups against particular corporations that engaged in objectionable practices. Boycotts are a nonviolent way of pressuring a group, company, or organization to change its ways. Consumers use boycotts to encourage companies to change their hiring practices, for example, or their environmental policies or investment practices. A classic example of a boycott is when consumers refuse to shop at a store because of the company's policies, or when a group refuses to purchase a product because of the actions of a manufacturer or producer. Governments can also use a boycott to express disapproval, such as the U.S. boycott against the 1980 Summer Olympics held in Moscow. This was done in protest to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Trade embargoes. Another type of economic sanction is a trade embargo. An embargo occurs when one government prohibits commerce and trade with another country. Typically, imports and exports to and from the targeted country are blocked or otherwise prohibited. The object is to isolate the country economically and create domestic dissatisfaction with the offending government, since people in that country will suffer the effects of the embargo. Embargoes are serious sanctions that are meant to bring substantial economic harm to an offending country, usually for political reasons. In this respect, an embargo is like a boycott because both are punitive acts designed to force some sort of reform. But an embargo is an official policy act of governments against each other, while boycotts are generally undertaken by private citizens or organizations. Responding to a trade embargo. A country targeted by a trade embargo typically seeks trade relationships with other nations that are not part of the embargo. If the embargo shuts off the country from trade with many international trading partners, however, the isolated country often tries to develop a self-sufficient economy known as an autarky. Embargoes are a particularly controversial form of economic sanction. While they're intended as punishment for some specific policy or act by the government, they have widespread economic effects felt most severely by innocent citizens. The people who have nothing to do with forming the offending policy suffer the most, as government officials can support a high standard of living despite the embargo. Since 1962, the United States has imposed a severe trade embargo against the tiny island nation of Cuba. The embargo was put in place 2 years after a socialist revolution overthrew the Cuban president supported by the U.S. government. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader, instituted a policy of nationalization, and he took over property belonging to U.S. citizens. In response, the U.S. government imposed an embargo that prevents trade and most financial transactions. Despite the debilitating effect of the embargo on the Cuban economy and ordinary citizens, Castro's government has stayed in power. The trade embargo against Cuba remained in place in 2013, but it has since gone on to change with the policies of President Obama. Trade sanctions. A third type of economic sanction is a trade sanction. Typically, trade sanctions take the form of import tariffs, quotas, import or export licenses, or other obstacles to open trade. Trade sanctions are commonly used in a trade or policy dispute. A sanction is intended to harm the targeted country by making it difficult to trade with the country that imposes the sanction. Often, sanctions are limited to specific trade areas. Sanctions can be unilateral, imposed by one country on another country, or they can be multilateral, imposed by one or more countries on one or more other countries. For example, one country may conclude that another is unfairly subsidizing exports. The first country may retaliate by imposing import duties or some other sanction on goods or services imported from the other. Trade sanctions are frequently retaliatory in nature. They can result in a trade war where sanctions are continually increased as the warring parties attempt to inflict more and more punishment on each other. Organized supply limits. Another powerful economic sanction in the global marketplace is a form of control known as organized supply limits. These are limits put on the supply of a certain good or service by producers in order to increase prices, punish the consumer, or protect a resource. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, makes use of organized supply limits. You already know that OPEC is a cartel that routinely limits oil supplies. In general, the purpose is to keep oil prices high and to make profits. Sometimes, though, OPEC's production limitations are used for political purposes. Because OPEC controls so much of the world's oil supply, and because the global economy is so heavily dependent on oil as a source of energy, OPEC sanctions are widely felt. The 1973 oil crisis. In 1973, OPEC imposed an embargo on oil exports to the U.S. and its Western allies. The embargo was a result of the ongoing Yom Kippur War with Israel. OPEC nations were no longer going to ship oil to countries that supported Israel in its conflict with Syria and Egypt. The embargo hurt the targeted countries where consumers had to wait in long lines to fill their gas tanks. But ultimately, OPEC suffered as well. New sources of oil were found by expanding drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea, and the market grew open to non-OPEC producers. While OPEC still has considerable influence on the price of oil in 2013, its ability to control the price of oil has diminished greatly over the last 40 years. The use and abuse of economic sanctions. Governments, international organizations, and individuals can use the power of money to try to influence the behavior of other economic and political players. The ultimate goal of any economic sanction is to encourage reform behavior by inflicting economic pain. Sometimes sanctions work, achieving their intended effect by getting the targeted company or country to change the offending behavior. Sometimes, though, sanctions hurt innocent people, such as in extended embargoes against a country that denies its people access to basic products and services. Often, the group that imposes the sanctions get hurt as much as the target. Overall, economic sanctions are not good for the global economy because they limit trade and impose unnecessary costs. Test your knowledge of the various forms of sanctions by matching each type with its definition. Human rights embargo. Embargoes are particularly strict forms of economic restriction. It is a rare and extreme measure for the U.S. government to place an embargo on another country because of the disruptions such a move creates, but it does happen. Currently, U.S. citizens aren't allowed to travel or do business with Cuba, Iran, and North Korea because of the long-standing trade embargoes, and that has since changed for Cuba. This limits the access the U.S. consumers and travelers have to goods and services available in the global marketplace. Currently, trade embargoes have a minimal effect on U.S. consumers because only a small number of nations face strong sanctions. But what would happen if an embargo was placed against a larger country like China? Many human rights activists are critical of the U.S. trade relationship with China. They often call for an embargo against China to punish human rights violations. In this activity, you will look for products in your home that were made in China and reflect on the potential effects of trade sanctions against China. And that takes us to the end of 6.04, International Organizations 2. As always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.